And now it's time for our featured interview here on WHCT World News. In early 1994, a Marine, Lance Corporal named Jeff Seeger, stationed at 29 Palms Marine Base in California, sent a letter to the New American Magazine describing a combat arms survey that asked Marines if they would be willing to fire on U.S. citizens who resisted gun confiscation measures. Lance Corporal Seeger was one of several hundred who had combat experience in recent deployments abroad. They were mustered in a mass hall to take the 46-question survey. It was administered by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander Ernest Guy Cunningham, who was working on a master's thesis dealing with the deployment of U.S. military units under foreign command as part of a UN-supervised mission abroad. Marines were asked about their willingness to serve under the operational command of foreign military officers and if they would be willing to swear an oath of allegiance to the United Nations. But the final question was positively thermonuclear. Quote, "The U.S. government declares a ban on the possession, sale, transportation, and transfer of all non-sporting firearms. A 30-day amnesty period is permitted for those firearms to be turned over to the local authorities. At the end of this period, a number of citizen groups refused to turn over their firearms. Consider the following statement. I would fire upon U.S. citizens who refuse to resist confiscation of firearms banned by the U.S. government." End quote. Even in that pre-internet era, news of the 29 Palms Combat Arms Survey went viral through fax networks, talk radio, and word of mouth. Lieutenant Commander Cunningham was accused by many as promoting civilian disarmament or the transfer of the U.S. military to UN control. In fact, he supported neither of these objectives. Instead, he was using his survey to determine the extent to which such policy choices would have the support of military personnel who had served in combat abroad. When Cunningham released his findings, it was revealed that more than 61% of the Marines who took the survey responded that they wouldn't carry out such an order under any circumstances. Now, 20 years later, we are being told that for young military officers, willingness to fire on U.S. citizens is a prerequisite for promotion. We see the U.S. military perpetually deployed overseas in multilateral peacekeeping and nation-building missions, often at the direction of the UN Security Council. And there are ominous developments on the civilian disarmament front as well. How have things changed since the 29 Palms Combat Arms Survey? Discussing that question with Lieutenant Commander Cunningham himself. Lieutenant Commander, thank you so much for joining us today. What was the most important thing you learned from your survey in 1994?
Well, sir, I found that there was a great divide between the soldiers and how they considered themselves in their roles as the American fighting man, upholding the Constitution and defending it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. A divide in their loyalty as to whether or not it laid all with the United States of America and its Constitution, or to that of the United Nations and its Charter. And also a significant portion showed a lack of distinction between what is a legal order and an illegal order.
Now, how have attitudes among military personnel changed in the nearly 20 years since you carried out that survey?
Well, I haven't been able to do a survey, and actually I think it would not be an exercise that would be profitable for this reason. Back in 1994, when I conducted the survey, there was not the command influence, the biases. The public had not known anything about the work that I was doing. And so, in a sense, I ambushed the Marines that were used in the survey. Since that time, what has changed is, I submit, a paradigm shift from the use of Department of Defense personnel, Army, Marines, in peacekeeping, peace enforcement operations, which date back to the Korean police action and the Vietnam police action, where we were first involved in armed conflict. With 9/11, we had the war on terrorism declared by President Bush. That with the 9/11. Shortly thereafter, we had the Patriot Act to come about. And so America, at a most vulnerable time, and justifiably so, was drawn into from armed conflicts by declaration of war by the Congress, which then progressed to the UN war police actions, to now an attack on our soil by terrorists. And this caused a great paradigm shift in the minds of the Americans and subsequently our soldiers. And so a survey like the one I did before would be pointless, if you please.
Now, a couple years ago, the Obama administration launched a war on Libya without any congressional involvement whatsoever, solely on the supposed authority of the UN Security Council. Is the UN effectively in control of the United States military, in your opinion?
Yes, sir. I go back to when I was doing my thesis work, which started in the fall of 1993, and an article I read by Pat Buchanan in the Conservative Chronicle is what motivated me to do the study. In that, at the time, Presidential Review Decision 13 was coming under fire, and President Clinton sent the document to be massaged back to the State Department. Now, understand that the only folks that have ever seen this document and read it in its entirety have been members of the State Department. The legislative branch, the judiciary branch, have never seen the document. President Clinton's administration's policy on multilateral operations, wherein the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, had the sole authority to place any type and number of American military personnel under the direct operational command and control of the United Nations. In the civilian version that was released May 10th, 1994, repeatedly they claimed that the President would never be relieved of his Commander-in-Chief authority of these personnel, though they would be placed physically under the direct operational control of the United Nations out in the field.
Now, on March 7th of last year, in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta claimed that the President, not the Congress, has the authority to commit the U.S. to war, and that this action can be authorized by the UN Security Council or by NATO. Does this mean that U.S. military personnel are actually, in effect, United Nations fighting persons, to use as an expression from your survey?
Going back a little bit in history, under the War Powers Act of 1973, President Richard Nixon, he had the authority to commit troops into harm's way without initially reporting to the Congress. He was then given a period of time in which to report to Congress for the Congress's approval as to whether or not the action taken by the President would continue to proceed, or they would simply cut off the appropriations with such an operation. With Presidential Decision Directive 25, the House, the Congress specifically, is certainly bypassed, and the President is able to go ahead and commit, as I mentioned earlier, any number and type of military personnel. And the thing is, in this, is that once again, with our partnership with the UN through the UN Treaty, October 1945, signed by Harry S. Truman, the Constitution and the declaration of war by the Congress goes per se by the wayside. And so they've been able to manipulate the Constitution using a treaty provision in order to bypass the Congress of its authority. And my question is that where does the fault really lie here in this situation? Is it with the president, or is it actually with the authority that is given to the Congress of the United States?
Lieutenant Commander, your survey also dealt with changes in the culture and structure of the military. Since 1994, we've seen the full integration of homosexuals into the military, and more recently, an end to restrictions on female soldiers in combat. In your view, are these developments intended to make our military more compatible with UN-centered global missions?
It is, but it's a lot more ominous than that. My thesis focused on factors that affect unit cohesion. And unit cohesion is the human element in combat that a unit has that aids to keep them survivability-wise and combat effectiveness-wise together. And so mission success is paramount on the unit cohesion of whatever fighting unit there is. Our nation, with the Magna Carta, was established as a Christian nation. 26 of the signers of the Constitution held Christian seminary degrees. In our Declaration of Independence, it states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with inalienable rights." That means that God gave them, man did not, governments did not. Man cannot take them away. They are endowed by our Creator. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this umbrella of Christianity involves the human element of those that are upholding and defending our Constitution of the United States. And scripturally, women and homosexuals are not to be a part of that fighting force. Now, we can take it further because, especially with homosexuals, for years it was very clear that this could be used as a leverage on an individual that holds information that is vitally important to the security of the United States. I had the privilege in 1990, early 94, of interviewing Admiral James Stockdale, which most of you should recall that he was POW. And I specifically asked him the question at the time of women in combat. The policy of don't ask, don't tell was on the horizon, but more so the women in combat issue was there. The Navy Postgraduate School had several grants from congressmen of students doing studies on the aspect of women in combat. And Admiral Stockdale's comments were that absolutely not. That the nature of man in and of itself is undeniable, in that in a combat situation, his focus will be deteriorated by his concerns for the safety of a woman. So thereby deterioration of unit cohesion and combat effectiveness.
Now, Ernest, several prominent figures, including Democratic Representative Charlie Rangel of New York and General Stanley McChrystal, have called for a return to the draft. Switching gears now, do you think that that could actually happen?
Whether or not it happens, I'm not for it. You know, when we were first established as a country and got through everything in our war against Britain and such, standing armies, we were to have a small standing army and a navy. This coincides with what came to play with the establishment of America, with the American citizen soldier. Now that became compulsory. Every able-bodied male, American citizen, upon reaching an age of possibly 12 through 16, was a compulsory member of the unorganized militia. So there was no need for a large standing army as life went on in the establishment of the Great Experiment, which came to be known as the United States of America. The draft is already in place by default. As far as a standing army and such, to be draft-oriented, conscription-oriented, as it used to be, no, sir. It may happen, but I don't agree with it.
Now, let's go back to your survey for a moment, because it dealt with posse comitatus law, which forbids the use of military as a domestic law enforcement body. Is the posse comitatus law a dead letter today?
It has been made to appear so. If we go back to the Waco, Texas, and David Koresh and Attorney General Janet Reno, and the use of military personnel, equipment, the media getting behind them and calling it a compound, that we saw the isolation, geographical isolation of that place there. We saw the use of psychological operations wherein they used speakers 24/7, loud music, helicopters, by testimony of a little girl drawing with a crayon, flying over the building and firing down on it with machine gun fire. And the documentaries that were filmed that show clearly that there was aggressive action against those individuals there. Now that the use of military personnel, there were Special Forces advisors there. That was a direct violation of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. Then we see the same sort of thing, but on a much smaller scale, with the Ruby Ridge incident with Randy Weaver, wherein the newly formed hostage rescue team was drawn in, and Randy, being a white separatist, was labeled as a white supremacist. And again, there was Special Forces advisors that were there. Randy himself was a former Special Forces soldier. And then we come to Katrina, where we saw FEMA exercising their authority that was given to them to declare martial law, and the house-to-house searches to disarm the citizens there of New Orleans began. It was cut off later, but nonetheless it began. The people were interned in the Super Bowl. All roads leading into and exit from were blocked from folks coming in and folks going out. The 82nd Airborne, members of the 82nd Airborne were called in. Citizens were, for looting, shot, killed. And so you had no trial by jury, but because someone was looting or not conforming to the curfews and the martial law, were subject to execution.
I want to jump in real quick because you're talking about being executed without a trial by jury, and now we see the use of unmanned aerial drones has increased dramatically in recent years, now being approved for use domestically. We've seen Eric Holder discuss the constitutional authority, so-called, that the president has to execute Americans here. Are you troubled by this?
Yes, sir. Deeply troubled. We've had terrorism redefined in this country, and it was through the Patriot Act that this has been occurring. And with the suspected activities of an individual being defined as terrorist, that the individual can be arrested without a warrant, detained, and not have the right to a trial by jury. This redefinition of terrorism has given a gateway, the eye of the federal government to bypass the constitutional laws of the United States.
Now, Ernest, what practical measures can be undertaken to restore the U.S. military to its proper constitutional role?
For starters, repeal of the UN treaty, repeal of the War Powers Act of 1973, repeal of the Patriot Act would be good for starters.